So not necessarily going to pin it all on Trotsky, the theory of the United Front. It's a pretty central sort of component of international socialist practice, and but certainly there's some good quotes that I will give you from Trotsky at some of the high points of working class struggle, where you had some of the best expressions of what is needed in terms of reaching out to workers, revolutionary organisations, revolutionaries reaching out to and attempting to mobilise alongside and with workers who aren't revolutionary, who have reformist ideas and reformist consciousness. But just to start, I thought to start it off, I'd say there's a big contradiction, I think, between two of the main ideas of Marxism, that we hold to. Two of the main sort of tenets, I guess you'd say, of Marxism that we hold to. The first is that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. That mainstream ideology that exists out there in society, it exists, and it's so strong, it's pumped out through the education system, the media, etc., because it serves the interests of the capitalist class. It's an expression of their worldview. It justifies the operations of their system. So on the one hand, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. And on the other hand, we're calling for a socialist revolution, whereas Marx says the self-emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class. It's not something that's done by anyone else. Workers will themselves, smash capitalism and establish a new society. So how do we reconcile this contradiction between, on the one hand, we say everyone out there, is walking around with this dominant ideology in their head, which serves the interests of capitalism, and on the other hand, these people are going to liberate themselves. The working class is going to liberate themselves. And that's where it really comes into discussing, I think two of the central sort of strategic tasks of socialists is firstly building a revolutionary party, and secondly building united fronts for struggle to overcome that contradiction. So the first thing to look at, this idea that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. I've gone over what that points to. Most people do accept the ideas that justify the operation of the system. So say, for example, nationalism. All the time we're fed nationalism constantly. School, the media, whatever it might be. The idea that we all as Australians have got some common interest, that there's a national interest, that we're all in it together in some way. This is a bourgeois idea. This is a ruling class idea. This is a reflection of their need for a nation state, their need for a national coherence in a block of capital that can compete internationally, for a nation state that can project their ideas, internationally, but it's accepted by people. The idea that the police, just exist to protect, order, protect civil order, make sure that we all get on, that we don't murder each other, that people don't break into each other's houses, that this is the sort of the function of the police, is just to ensure the smooth operations of the system, whereas in reality, the police exist to protect private property and protect, capitalist social relations, as we know it. And a lot of the time, people's actual experiences of the world reinforce, these dominant ideas. So say, for example, the idea that human beings are inherently selfish, are inherently competitive, that we're going to want to dominate other people. That this is somehow, inherent in our human nature. This is how you get ahead, is by being ruthless and trying to assert your interests. And this is some expression of human nature. Well, on the one hand, this is people's experience of life under capitalism, life in a market society where there is a dog-eat-dog reality to the world, where it looks as though the fact that someone else is getting a job means you don't have a job, the fact that someone else is getting a house means you don't get a house, where if I can maybe be better friends with my boss, I'll be less likely to get sacked because someone's got to be sacked. Like those sorts of ideas become common sense because it's the reality of the world that you're interacting with. But on the other hand, people have plenty of experiences in their life which actually contradict the mainstream ideas. The strength of dominant ideology. Nationalism that I discussed before. I mean, people will meet people from other nationalities all the time and realise, actually, this is a good friend of mine, I've got a lot more in common with them than I might have with some other Aussies, etc. But even more powerfully, in terms of, a challenge to the system, or ideas which can actually challenge the system, is people learn through struggle, the way that, those ideas are actually, in many ways, against their interests and are being used against them, and that there's an alternative perspective about how they might be able to advance in the world that's about being part of a class, struggling as a class, etc. So the experience of actually, fighting against people, being sacked at work, by going on strike and winning those sorts of struggles, fighting for pay rises by going on strike and winning for those sorts of struggles, you can come to recognise, the power, of working class action, is a far more powerful force actually than any little individual initiative you might take to try and get ahead, of another worker. The development of those sorts of ideas, this is what we call a contradictory consciousness that's held by most people, in capitalist society. On the one hand, constantly being fed the dominant ideas, constantly coming up against, the limitations of the system which reinforce those ideas. On the other hand, having a whole other experience, of life, and particularly, as I said, for many people through history, and working class people through history have had histories of struggle, that they hold to, and that they can point to. And we call reformism is the expression of those contradictory ideas. On the one hand, recognising actually there's a hell of a lot wrong with this system and I'd like a whole lot of things to change, and on the other hand, actually accepting the general setup of the way that society operates. So something might be wrong, but if we're going to get changes, it's going to have to happen within the limits of the system. I forget the name of the theorist, but I love this quote from a Marxist theorist who says, for many people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Like you just actually can't see, for many people, the possibilities of the actual fundamental transformation. It's presented to you as being that there's this, political process that we can vote, or, we can have some sort of small political change that might ameliorate some of the problems that I've got with the system, but can't see, the need for, that far more profound transformation. And as well as that just general reformist consciousness that comes from daily life in capitalism, you also have, through the emergence of capitalist society and the struggles of working class people, the development of trade unions and a trade union bureaucracy, which embody, in far more material ways, those reformist ideas and that reformist consciousness within organisations of the trade unions, which exist. On the one hand, they get their power from working people actually organising collectively. In the final analysis, they get their power from, the capacity of workers to strike and to fight, and to fight collectively. Whereas on the other hand, they exist within this entire legal framework of capitalism, which will allow them to operate. They exist to actually bargain the sale of labour power to the system. So this is a profoundly contradictory role where, on the one hand, they need workers' struggle and they need workers' organisation and they need some sort of fight, to exist and to have any power. Whereas on the other hand, they're actually, exist and have an interest in maintaining, the smooth operation of the wage labour system. They at the end of the day, they want to do the deal, get the agreement, the terms on which labour will be exploited. Will be set through those trade union structures. So this is like a particular expression of that of reformist consciousness and of that contradictory consciousness. And it's out of that experience of understanding the extreme limitations of those sort of workers' organisations and the real limitations of reformist political organisation that Lenin and the Bolsheviks and then more generally through the experience of the Communist International, the communist movement more broadly, came up with the theory that we actually need a clearly revolutionary party that doesn't try to pretend that it's an organisation for all workers at all times, as major social democratic reformist parties had, prior to that. We don't position ourselves as being the party of all of the workers, even though we position ourselves as the best fighters, for working class interests. We recognise that actually having a revolutionary consciousness, actually recognising that not only the possibility but the necessity of taking on and smashing the system and organising society on a fundamentally different basis, this requires you establishing separate organisations of that militant minority, of that revolutionary minority, that can consistently contest the dominant ideas, consistently offer an alternative worldview, that's actually based in, the possibilities of socialism, the possibilities of a life, based on collective control, and solidarity. And that organisation is needed to fight day in, day out against the dominant ideology, to hold the lessons. We talk about the Revolutionary Party being the memory of the class, to actually hold the lessons of, all of the struggles that have come before, but also as a weapon, as a force to actually organise and take forward the struggles of working people and the oppressed. So that was the sort of theoretical break that came, with the development of the Bolsheviks and with Lenin and the Communist International, was the need for that to organise explicitly as a revolutionary minority, as a revolutionary party, if we want to take on reformist ideas and reformist consciousness. But this brings us to the second part, the second, tenet, if you like, of Marxism that I talked about in the opening, and that's that the self-emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, not the act of a revolutionary minority. Right, so you might have established this revolutionary minority that has this understanding of, the need for that, fundamental revolutionary change, but it's not the Revolutionary Party that's going to bring about that change. It's workers themselves. It's workers themselves actually, in struggle, taking control of their workplaces, mass upheaval, confronting and smashing the state. That's the sort of action that's going to get us there. And the United Front, is put forward as the central strategy for how do we actually build that bridge between a revolutionary organisation that has all this whole analysis about what's wrong with the system and the struggle that's required against it, and the mass of working class people who hold reformist ideas and reformist consciousness. How can the Revolutionary Party actually act as a small cog that can turn a much bigger wheel, bring people into struggle, where they can firstly actually feel their own power, they can actually win demands day to day, defend their interests day to day, and on the other hand, draw lessons, from those experiences about the true nature of the system. As I went over before, there's no education you can get really about the true nature of the police, the true nature of Parliament, the true nature of the media, or whatever it might be, other than when you're actually hard up against the system in struggle, when the police are coming in and smashing picket lines and the media's printing justifications for the police smashing picket lines and the parliamentarians are arguing that this is necessary action and will give more budget for the police to smash picket lines. That's when you really come to learn about the nature of, of the government that you had once seen as this sort of the state as this neutral arbiter that can just allow civil society to operate. It is in the process of struggle. So how do you get there? And that's the United Front, is seen as that strategic orientation to actually reaching out and mobilising alongside reformist workers. And it has a huge range. It's a very, very general formulation about what's needed. But there's a huge range of possible forms, of organisation that you could point to say this is an expression of a United Front strategy. So Trotsky, for example, in the Communist International meetings was saying, just as the trade union is the rudimentary form of the United Front in the economic struggle, so the Soviet is the highest form of the United Front under the conditions in which the proletariat enters the epoch of fighting for power. So there's two examples. The trade union's an example of a United Front. Trade unions have got revolutionaries in them. Not very many these days, but got revolutionaries in them, very often the best militants, some of the best activists, agitating for the broader, changes are revolutionaries, but of course, vast majority of workers who are in trade unions are, have a reformist consciousness and hold them there. But together in a trade union, you can formulate programs for action, you can struggle together, you can fight together, you can agitate, to push the boundaries of what people have thought is possible. The Soviet was also understood, even though this was an organ of revolutionary power that actually smashed the state in Russia, the capitalist state, and became itself an organ of workers' power, a workers' state. This was also conceived of by the Bolsheviks right up through to the insurrection, actually, as a united front. Where there's a very furious argument saying who is actually going to take power in October of 1917? Will it be the Bolshevik Party, or will it be done in the name of the Soviets, where you had other reformists, Menshevik and other sort of tendencies that were involved in that process. But it wasn't really theorised as, in this terms of a united front sort of at that point in 1917 when the revolution happened. You had, in that period after the First World War, this enormous surge forward in a revolutionary wave in Europe. And around the world, actually, anti-colonial rebellions that were taking place around the world. And the Communist International meetings, these were meetings that called by the Russian Communist Party, but trying to bring other workers that were realising the limitations of the social democratic parties that had taken them to war right across Europe, to say this is where the hard line for the opening couple of meetings, 1919, 1920, from the Communist International, was polemicising about this idea about the need to actually break with social democracy. If we're going to be able to carry forward this revolutionary wave, we need revolutionary organisations, that are clearly, on the lines of the vanguard party that I discussed earlier. That this is the break that needs to happen. So they drew up like the 21 conditions. If you want to join the Communist International, you need a revolutionary organisation that's clearly anti-imperialist, for the smashing of the state. Will at all points in all forums expose the treacherous social democratic leaders, who betrayed the working class, etc., etc. This was the thrust, if you like, 1919, 1920, through the Communist International, was that first side of the equation, the importance of the Revolutionary Party. 1922, 1923, the third and fourth congresses, this is a period actually where that revolutionary wave has well and truly ebbed. The 2 red years in Italy, had come to a close. Mussolini was on the march. The German Communist Party had launched, an ultra-left sort of putsch and been smashed, and were on the defensive. And it's in this period that the Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries in the Communist International started to really argue for the importance of that second side of the equation. Yes, you need your revolutionary organisation. It must be absolutely clearly for the smashing of the state. It must be built on that basis. But if we are going to defend ourselves in a context of a receding revolutionary wave, a rise of fascism, a rise of the right, etc., we are going to need to seriously orient to mobilising masses of workers who haven't yet been convinced of revolutionary politics. So I'll just read a quote from Trotsky at the Congress in 1922 on the United Front. He said, "If the Communist Party had not broken drastically and irrevocably with the reformist Social Democrats, it would not have become the party of the proletarian revolution. It would have forever remained a parliamentary safety valve attached to the bourgeois state. Whoever does not understand this does not know the first letter of the ABC of communism. If the Communist Party did not seek for organisational avenues that at every given moment joint coordinated action between the communist and non-communist, including social democratic working masses, were made possible, it would have thereby laid bare its own incapacity to win over, on the basis of mass action, the majority of the working class. It would degenerate into a communist propaganda society, but never develop into a party for the conquest of power. It's not enough to possess the sword, one must give it an edge. It's not enough to give the sword an edge, one must know how to wield it. After separating the communists from the reformists, it's not enough to fuse the communists together by means of organisational discipline. It's necessary that this organisation should learn how to guide all the collective activities of the proletariat in all spheres of its living struggle." This is the second letter of the alphabet of communism. So number 1, Revolutionary Party. Number 2, United Front. You have to find a way to, and this is, the report was on the United Front. This is a speech he gave to the Congress. You must go out and build, struggles that can actually bring reformist workers into action. And at that point in time in Europe, you had mass social democratic parties and mass communist parties. And a lot of the way that people discussed how we were going to get these united fronts was to appeal to the social democratic parties to enter into formal agreements around demands for struggle that both could agree with. So, no cut in wages, action against the rise of the far right, etc., etc. Basic things that everyone could agree with. Right, let's get together and get out on the street and fight for these. And then there was a struggle that was waged workplace by workplace, factory council by factory council, etc., to try and convince social democratic parties and social democratic workers to come in behind, these United Front initiatives. So that was like one particular time, and there's a whole story about what happened in the 20s. This is actually very, very successful. The German Communist Party recovers enormously from about 44,000 members in mid-1921, up more than 200,000 by the end of 1922, precisely because of this orientation, that had come out of the experience of the Communist International. So that's the sort of, if you like, the classical period of the United Front that we might talk about, but I'm running out of time. But I do think, as I made the point at the end, it's not just like, okay, there's that one form, then that's the United Front. It's an art all the time about how, as a revolutionary organisation, do you try and build alliances, raise demands that'll actually bring people into struggle that don't agree with you about the need to smash the system, but will actually push up against the government, push up against the employers, highlight the contradictions of the system and defend working class interests. It's only, at the end of the day, mass action that can actually defend our immediate interests, and it's only mass action that allows people to learn, about the need to push on, further to revolution. So, if we talk, all the time, even about, organising a particular demonstration, you think about it when you go out to build it. One of the things that we'll do, if we're going to be building a major demonstration, have a good think about who's going to be on the speaking platform. And it's not just who's going to get up and make the most fiery speech against this policy or whatever. We think very consciously, how can we actually make sure that there's organisations that are represented on this platform that will make it more comfortable for workers that might be looking at it, or people that might be looking at it as a bit radical as this demonstration, I don't know about the people organising it. There's a speaker from, whatever it might be, trade union speaker, Labor Party speaker, Green speaker, what community organisation, whatever it might be. Okay, it's looking like it's got, a broader support. It's looking like it's got a broader appeal. This is something that I'm going to be interested in, in actually going along to. So that's one thing, seeking endorsements for organisation, for demonstrations. We'll go out and try very, very hard to convince, union branches, political, other, more mainstream political groups, but, also, as I said, community organisations, NGOs even, sometimes or whatever, we can endorse this demonstration to show, to show people that it has broad support, and to bring people into struggle. We do pay a lot of attention though in these, through these processes of building these rallies and to these campaigns, to the particular nature of the demands that you raise in those circumstances. The demand needs to have a cut against the government, and it needs to have a widespread appeal. It needs to be something that's, very, very clearly is going to take a fight to win. There's no point calling a rally for something people aren't going to want to fight. We're going to actually have to fight and struggle, and we agree with that demand, and we're going to come out and we're going to win. We don't put forward the maximum program. In the refugee campaign, we don't have, open borders, smash all nations, or whatever on our. That's what we believe. We don't put that on the thing. We say bring them here. Which actually does let them land. Of course. That people should be able to refugees should be able to land. But implicit in that is actually a fight against, the border itself, the detention regime, the migration regime. So you're trying to build that tension in, and you're trying to, radicalise and mobilise people through the process. And we don't accept there being actually demands put up in these, where we have influence, demands putting up in these campaigns or things which raise demands which actually divide, the working class. So we struggle very, very hard, for example, against the slogan of Aussie jobs. Even though it's very widespread, understood, everyone will, Aussie jobs, we'll go along to that rally. Nationalism's a mainstream idea. We do not accept that Aussie jobs should go up on the thing. Union jobs, or whatever it might be. It's not revolutionary to say union jobs, but but there is a challenge, if you like, that requires a revolutionary analysis about what's wrong with having an Aussie Jobs slogan, as part of a united front that you're going to try and campaign around. The way that does actually take the class backward, even when you might be in a process of mobilising. Okay, so I'm probably coming to the end of the thing, and there's plenty of other examples, and I'm sure that they'll come out in the discussion. But I did just want to finish. This is quite a good quote from a SWP comrade writing in the 1970s, Duncan Hallis, when the party in Britain were really reviving, if you like, a lot of the theory that hadn't hadn't been discussed, as much within the Marxist movement for a long time. There's a whole story about what Stalin did to the whole politics of the United Front, etc., that I won't go into. But there was a real revival, if you like, of trying to theorise and think about, these politics, in the IS in the 1970s. But this is quite a good quote that he wrote about it at the time. He said, "The United Front is not a substitute for a revolutionary party. The United Front tactic can never, under any circumstances, mean the subordination of revolutionary politics and organisation to reformist politics and organisation. It presupposes the existence and independence of a revolutionary force. The bigger that force, the greater the United Front possibilities." And I think we can recognise that. How much difference would it make to the Right to Strike campaign, which is not a campaign for revolution, it's a campaign for some basic industrial rights. How much difference would it make to building that campaign if we were twice the size we were? If we had another 20, industrial militants that are in this organisation, or whatever. So he says, so the bigger that force, the greater the United Front possibilities. It's not a let's forget our differences and unite approach. On the contrary, the United Front tactic always and inevitably involves a political struggle to compel reformists and centrists to live up to their own pretensions, to break some of their ties with the capitalist establishment, both direct and through the trade union bureaucracy, and to engage in a fight alongside revolutionaries for objectives they themselves profess to support. And I just wanted to finish on that because I think that that's also, quite an important point, is that, very often revolutionaries and reformists will have agreement on demands. Change the rules is a very good example. For example, we could all agree, for example, about the need to scrap the penalty rate cut. Okay, but it's quite different about how are we going to scrap the penalty rate cut between a reformist approach, the approach of the trade union bureaucracy, which sees it pretty much squarely in electoral terms. We'll go out, we'll campaign for the election of a Labor government who can reverse the penalty rate cut, versus us who say, actually, what's needed if we're going to be able to seriously defend the wages of low-paid people is an industrial campaign. We need strikes. But every little thing that we do going around trying to move the motions in the union branches, etc., to call for self-activity. We want delegates meetings. We want demonstrations. We want mobilisation around these demands that you're all saying you're supporting. You're putting memes out and this and saying, change the rules. Great. Let's have a rally. Let's have a strike. You're relating to that sentiment. You're relating to that reformist sentiment, that is there, and you're trying to, as it says, engage in a fight for objectives that the reformists themselves profess to support. It opens up the possibilities, the fact that reformist leaders will actually come out and speak about the need for change, speak about the need to campaigning, but it's up to revolutionaries to actually really pull those sentiments into self-activity, into action, and build the power of the broader working class in the process of building the revolutionary organisation. Thank you.